What if I told you that every single day, people are quietly stopped from leaving the country, not at borders, not in handcuffs, but with one invisible decision made behind the scenes? No headlines, no outrage, just a sudden you're not going anywhere. Now imagine that same thing allegedly happening to one of the most powerful and recognizable figures on the planet, right as a plane is preparing for takeoff. That's when an ordinary rule suddenly feels extraordinary. When the words "flight aborted" and "former president" appear in the same sentence, your brain instantly jumps to drama engines roaring, authorities stepping in, a moment frozen on the runway. But here's the twist. The real story isn't about a plane at all. It's about power meeting resistance. And what happens when the systems most people live under every day appear to brush up against elite privilege? So before you decide what to believe, stay with me, because whether every detail holds up or not, this moment exposes something far bigger about mobility, money, and why accountability feels shocking only when it reaches the top. And here's the first reason this story exploded so fast. We are not used to seeing power interrupted. Most people hear the phrase "flight aborted" during takeoff and instantly picture danger, urgency, or wrongdoing. Add the words "former president" and the story suddenly feels unreal, almost cinematic. That reaction isn't accidental, it's psychological. Our brains are trained to associate wealth and influence with uninterrupted movement, access, and control. For everyday people, being stopped from traveling isn't shocking at all. It happens quietly and constantly. Passports get flagged, judges restrict movement, missed payments, open court cases, child support disputes. These things can freeze your ability to leave the country without warning. The difference is simple. When it happens to ordinary people, nobody cares. There are no breaking news banners or viral headlines. It's treated as normal. But when the same possibility brushes against someone like Donald Trump, the public feels whiplash. Why? Because power usually moves freely. Private planes don't wait in lines. Influence smooths obstacles. Wealth buys time. So the idea, even the rumor, that those rules might not apply for a moment feels shocking. Not because the rule is extreme, but because the person involved isn't supposed to experience it. This is why the story didn't need confirmation to spread. It touched a nerve people already feel, but rarely see acknowledged. The imbalance, the sense that there is one system for most people and another for those at the top. And when that invisible wall looks like it might crack, even briefly, attention rushes in. So the shock isn't really about a runway or a plane. It's about witnessing something that almost never happens. Privilege encountering friction. And once people sense that, they want to know what comes next, because it forces a question we don't often ask out loud. What happens when the rules finally reach someone powerful? Here's the second reason the story hit so hard. Travel is not just movement, it's power. For most people, traveling is conditional. You ask for time off, you check your bank balance, you worry about bills, responsibilities, and whether you can even afford to leave. Mobility is limited, fragile, and easily taken away. But for the wealthy and powerful, movement works very differently. At the top levels of society, travel becomes a strategic advantage. Private planes, multiple passports, international homes, global banking access. These aren't luxuries or escape options. They allow someone to reposition themselves geographically, legally, and financially with very little friction. That kind of mobility creates leverage, especially when legal or financial pressure starts to build. That's why even the suggestion that Donald Trump might have faced a momentary travel interruption feels so destabilizing. Because for elites, the ability to leave has always been assumed, and it's the ultimate safety valve. When things get uncomfortable, you move. When pressure rises, you buy time somewhere else. When consequences approach, distance becomes a shield. Now contrast that with everyday life. Most people couldn't relocate to another country, even if they wanted to. Jobs, debt, family, immigration rules, all of it keeps you anchored. Your movement is already restricted long before any court gets involved. That's why the system rarely worries about flight risk for regular people. You're already grounded by circumstance. So when travel itself appears to be questioned at the highest level, it signals something deeper. It suggests that one of the most reliable privileges of wealth, unchecked mobility, might not be absolute. and that possibility alone is enough to capture public attention. Options leverage time. When those begin to narrow even slightly, it tells us that pressure is real and that this is what made this moment impossible to ignore. The phrase flight risk sounds like something pulled straight from a movie: flashing lights, last-minute chases, dramatic confrontations on the runway. But in reality, it's one of the least dramatic concepts in the legal system, and that's exactly why it matters so much. Flight risk isn't about personality, emotion, or guilt. It's a cold, bureaucratic calculation. Courts and enforcement agencies look at a short, unexciting list. How much money does this person control? Do they have access to private transportation? Do they have business or personal ties outside the country? And most importantly, do they have an incentive to leave if pressure increases? That's it. No theatrics, no opinions, just risk assessment. Here's where the imbalance becomes clear. For most people, this calculation barely matters. You don't own a plane. You don't have foreign estates or offshore financial structures. You're tied down by work, bills, and obligations. Even if you wanted to disappear, the system knows you can't. Your life already limits your movement. But when someone like Donald Trump enters that equation, everything changes. Access to resources turns unlikely into possible. Mobility turns into leverage. And suddenly, something that sounds routine on paper becomes politically and socially explosive. That's why the concept of flight risk carries quiet power. It treats wealth not as protection, but as a factor that increases concern. The more options someone has, the more the system has to account for them. That idea runs against what people are used to seeing, where money usually softens consequences instead of sharpening scrutiny. So when you hear that phrase, don't imagine a chase scene. Imagine a checklist, a form, a decision made in an office, because those boring decisions are often where real power gets tested and where the most uncomfortable truths about inequality quietly surface. Here's the fourth reason this story wouldn't let go of the public imagination. It didn't need to be fully confirmed to feel meaningful. In a rational world, rumors fade quickly, but this one didn't. It spread, lingered, and sparked debate. That tells us something important. People weren't reacting to facts alone. They were reacting to a sense of imbalance they already recognized. For years, many have watched powerful figures move through legal, financial, and political trouble with very little visible consequence. Cases stretch on, deadlines shift, penalties get negotiated. Over time, this creates a quiet belief that accountability at the top is optional. So when a story appears that even hints at restriction, a pause, a delay, a boundary, it immediately feels significant, whether it's verified yet or not. This doesn't mean people want punishment or spectacle. It means they are starved for signs that the system can still apply friction upward, not just downward. For most people, accountability arrives quickly and without ceremony. Miss a payment, and the consequences are immediate. Miss a deadline, and options disappear. There is no buffer of influence or reputation to soften the landing. That's why the idea that someone like Donald Trump might experience even a moment of constraint feels destabilizing. It interrupts a long-running pattern where power appears insulated from inconvenience. The rumor becomes symbolic. It represents the possibility, however small, that the rules might touch someone. They usually glide past. So the story matters even before it's proven, because it exposes a collective question people are already asking. Do the rules ever reach the top, or do they only exist for everyone else? When a rumor can ignite that question so easily, that tells you the unease was already there, waiting for a spark. The fifth reason this story carries weight is because legal pressure is rarely just about innocence or guilt. At higher levels, it's about money, liquidity, and control. Courts don't only decide who is right or wrong, they decide who has access to resources, who can delay, and who can keep operating as if nothing has changed. When legal cases involve wealthy individuals, the focus often shifts to bonds, asset valuations, and financial guarantees. These aren't technical footnotes, they are pressure points. Requiring large sums of money forces someone to prove that. Their wealth isn't just theoretical. It asks a simple but uncomfortable question: is your money real, available, and accountable right now? This matters because a huge amount of elite wealth exists on paper. It's tied up in branding, to property valuations, stock estimates, and future expectations. That kind of wealth creates influence, but it doesn't always translate into cash. You can move instantly. When courts demand guarantees, they test whether power is backed by actual liquidity, not just reputation. That's why legal exposure can quietly change everything. Travel, business decisions, and risk tolerance all shift when money is under scrutiny. The ability to post bonds, secure insurance, or satisfy judgments determines how much freedom someone really has. Suddenly, time stops being a weapon and starts becoming a constraint. For someone like Donald Trump, whose public image has long been built on strength and dominance, even financial questioning carries symbolic weight. It suggests vulnerability, not in a dramatic way, but in a structural one. And markets, lenders, and partners notice that instantly. So this story isn't just about law, it's about whether wealth can still shield someone. When institutions start asking for proof instead of promises, that's a far more unsettling question, and one that explains why this moment feels heavier than a single headline. The sixth reason this story matters is because it exposes something most people feel but rarely hear stated clearly. Time itself is a privilege in the legal and financial system. Time is not neutral. It bends differently depending on who you are and what resources you have. For ordinary people, time is rigid, deadlines arrive fast, penalties stack up, and consequences hit hard and early. If you miss a rent payment, the clock starts immediately. If you fall behind on a bill, fees escalate. If you're sued, hearings move quickly and options narrow. There is very little room to maneuver. The system assumes urgency when dealing with people who don't have power, and it enforces it without hesitation. But for the wealthy, time becomes elastic. Cases stretch on, appeals delay outcomes, bonds are negotiated, valuations are argued, every extension preserves leverage, every delay buys breathing room. Time becomes a resource that can be managed, traded, and used strategically. That difference alone shapes outcomes more than most people realize. This is why moments that appear to compress time for powerful figures feel so disruptive. When legal, financial, or travel constraints start to overlap, delays stop working the way they used to. Suddenly, waiting isn't a shield, it's a risk. Pressure compounds instead of dissipating. For someone like Donald Trump, whose public and business history has often relied on stretching timelines, even small signs of urgency carry meaning. They suggest that the usual escape hatches, postponement, negotiation, deferral might not be as reliable as before. That's why this story resonates beyond politics. People recognize the contrast instantly. They know what it feels like to have no time, no flexibility, and no buffer. So when they see even a hint that time might be tightening at the top, it feels rare, almost unsettling. Because it raises the quiet question, what happens when delay finally runs out? The seventh reason this moment matters is because nothing has to fully happen for consequences to begin. In systems driven by money and confidence, even a pause can be enough. Markets don't wait for verdicts. Lenders don't wait for convictions. They react to uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads fast. When power looks even slightly constrained, for wealthy figures, reputation isn't just personal, it's financial infrastructure. Competence keeps credit flowing, stability reassures partners, control keeps negotiations favorable. When a story suggests that movement, liquidity, or legal freedom might be under question, those assumptions weaken. And when assumptions weaken, capital becomes cautious. This is where perception becomes reality. Insurers quietly reassess risk, lenders review exposure. Business partners hesitate before signing or extending terms. None of this requires a public announcement. By the time the public hears about it, the damage, or at least the adjustment, is already underway. For someone like Donald Trump, whose wealth and influence are deeply tied to branding and dominance, even temporary doubt matters. The image of control is not cosmetic, it's structural. When that image cracks, leverage shrinks, negotiations change tone, margins tighten. What makes this especially striking is how different the experience is for ordinary people. When uncertainty hits your life, there is no buffer. You feel it immediately in your job, your rent, your stress level. There are no layers of advisors absorbing the shock. So when viewers sense that uncertainty might be traveling upward for once, it feels almost unfamiliar. That's why the story lingered. It wasn't about proof or punishment. It was about instability touching the top of the pyramid, even briefly, and in systems built on confidence. Those brief moments can matter more than dramatic endings because power doesn't collapse all at once. It weakens when certainty disappears. The eighth reason this story is so revealing is because it reminds us of something most people forget. Real power never moves loudly. Movies train us to expect dramatic confrontations, flashing lights, raised voices, last-second stops. But in real life, especially at high levels, authority works through paperwork, procedure, and quiet coordination. Institutions don't operate on adrenaline. Filings, internal flags, and compliance checks. If anything unusual ever occurs around travel, it doesn't start with sirens. It starts with a form, a notification, or a request routed through multiple offices. That's why focusing only on spectacle misses the point entirely. The machinery that matters is slow, technical, and mostly invisible. This is also why headlines can be misleading. A dramatic image grabs attention, but the real story is always upstream. Court filings, bond negotiations, insurance reviews, travel authorizations, these are the levers that actually change outcomes. By the time the public sees anything, decisions may already have been made quietly behind closed doors. For someone like Donald Trump, this distinction matters. Power at that level doesn't collide with institutions head-on. It negotiates with them, it tests boundaries, it probes for flexibility, and institutions respond in their own language. Procedure, delay, clarification, review, none of it looks dramatic, but all of it shapes what's possible. This is why responsible analysis lives in an uncomfortable middle space. Alleged does not mean fake, but it also doesn't mean proven. Understanding how systems work means resisting the urge for instant conclusions and instead watching how processes unfold, who hesitates, who enforces, who grants exceptions quietly. It's whether administrative reality shifted at all. Because when rules start being applied through normal channels, calmly, methodically, without spectacle, that's often when the most meaningful changes begin. The ninth reason this story matters goes far beyond any single individual. Precedent is the real issue, not personality. People often get pulled into debates about whether they like or dislike Donald Trump, but that focus misses the larger question entirely. Systems don't change because of opinions. They change because of patterns. Every time a powerful figure encounters resistance, institutions are forced to choose. Do they enforce rules consistently, or do they quietly carve out exceptions? Those choices don't stay isolated. They ripple outward and shape how future cases are handled, especially when the next powerful person comes along. That's why moments like this carry weight, even if they don't end in dramatic outcomes. For most people, precedent works in only one direction. When rules tighten for regular citizens, they tighten quickly and permanently. Missed deadlines don't become flexible later. Penalties don't soften over time. Enforcement becomes the norm. But when precedent is set at the top, even informally, it signals whether accountability is conditional or structural. This is also why institutions move cautiously when dealing with power. Every action is scrutinized. Every decision is politicized. The pressure to hesitate is immense. But hesitation itself becomes a precedent. It teaches future actors what they can expect and what they can get away with. That's why this story resonated even without final answers. It raised the possibility that rules might apply upward, not just downward. And that possibility alone challenges a long-standing assumption many people hold, often subconsciously, that wealth and influence eventually override enforcement. So the real question isn't whether this moment becomes a turning point or a footnote. It's whether the next powerful person faces the same friction or glides through untouched. Because that pattern, repeated over time, determines whether trust in institutions erodes further or slowly begins to rebuild. The 10th and final reason this story matters is because it isn't distant or abstract. It connects directly to how you experience rules, fairness, and consequence in your own life. When people believe the system works differently depending on who you are, trust doesn't collapse all at once. It slowly erodes moment by moment. Think about how accountability shows up for you. Deadlines aren't flexible. Mistakes are costly. Missed payments, legal notices, or job issues come with immediate pressure. There's no negotiation window built on influence. You comply or you absorb the consequences. That lived experience shapes how people interpret stories like this one. So when even the possibility emerges that someone at the very top might face restriction, even briefly, it resonates. Not because people want punishment, but because they want consistency. They want to know the rules aren't just theoretical. They want proof that accountability isn't reserved for those without power. This is also why cynicism runs so deep. Many viewers assume nothing will change, because history has taught them that wealth often finds a way around consequences. That instinct isn't irrational, it's learned. But cynicism can also blind people to small shifts. Systems rarely change through dramatic collapses. They change through pressure, precedent, and exposure. For someone like Donald Trump, this moment sits at the intersection of money, law, and mobility, the same forces that quietly shape millions of lives every day. The difference is visibility. When pressure shows up at the top, everyone can see it. So whether this becomes a footnote or a signal, it already matters. It forces a question that affects everyone. Do the rules apply when it's inconvenient for the powerful, or only when it's easy? How that question is answered shapes trust, not just in courts, but in the system as a whole.